And Kevin, do you want to test out your slides or anything?
Oh yeah. Let me see. So I can share.
Yeah, I think if you go share, you should be able to do it. So, yes.
There's the screen sharing.
And you're appearing in it too. That's interesting.
Yeah, I figured out how to. We've been doing this so much. We figured out how to do both.
Oh, great. I've wondered how to do that as well.
If you use it as a backdrop rather than just a PowerPoint, it'll actually let you still be in the screen.
Cool. Good.
We are live on Facebook, I think. So
yes, we are. Yeah, but we haven't started yet. So we'll start in a minute or so, Kevin. Just to
Okay.
I'll start and introduce you, but we'll wait for another 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. My name is Ralph Borland, and you're watching an entire seminar hosted by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And today's guest presenter is Kevin Dawson. We're very happy to have Kevin here. Kevin is a historian of the African diaspora at the University of California, Merced. And I first came across Kevin's work through a local publication, a South African book that was released called AfroSurf, and I'll hold up the book to the screen. So this lovely and weighty volume has an essay by Kevin in it, locating the origins of surfing in Africa on Ghana's Gold Coast. And Kevin, I'm gonna ask you to, I think, wait with your screen sharing until.
Oh, sorry.
I've done the intro there. Thanks. So just to give you a bit of an intro, Kevin is going to be talking about his paper, A Sea of Caribbean Islands, Maritime, Maroons in the Greater Caribbean. And this is part of Kevin's wider project, which is looking at African aquatic cultures. He has the book that came out recently, Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, and that received the Harriet Tubman Prize for research in Black culture. If you've read Kevin's paper in preparation for the seminar, you'll know that it's about maritime maroons, enslaved peoples who managed to escape using their knowledge of navigation and watercraft. I also noticed you have a very, very poetic turn of phrase in your writing, Kevin, and I want to ask you a bit more about your writing process when we get to the questions and discussion stage. But I'm caught by phrases such as captives stitched islands and continents into constellations of hope through their ability to navigate waterways. So yeah, some really lovely writing in your paper. And I know that there's some people in this room who are really interested in island studies and archipelagic thinking. And I know that you're referencing some of that in your work as well. So Kevin, thanks very much for joining us. I know it's early in the morning in California. So please take it away. You have the next half hour or so, and then we'll have discussions afterwards.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ralph. I really appreciate the invitation and the introduction. Sorry for the screen sharing thing. I didn't know that was going to change everything. Let me put up my PowerPoint and then get into the talk. And I appreciate everybody attending. I mean, this is a really great opportunity, and it's part of a bigger project that I'll talk about at the end of my kind of opening presentation. And so I want to start really with an anecdote about these images here. I mean, these kind of voyeuristic images were really popular in the 19th century among travel accounts, as well as descriptions of African women in both Africa and in the Americas bathing. And I think they're important because they helped African people understand. I mean, these are one of the many ways I think that African people understood water perhaps differently than Europeans. And so I want to start, like I said, with an anecdote. I just read this kind of quickly and then go over my talk and then open it up for conversation. But I want to start with this anecdote of not of maritime maroons, but of enslaved women swimming at a Jamaican beach that both illustrates diverging African and European aquatic proficiencies and how captives use water and swimming to challenge their circumstances. So importantly, enslaved women understood that white men objectified their bodies, knowing that rape could be their cruel rite of passage into womanhood. On land, women's ability to escape sexual exploitation was limited. Conversely, water and aquatic expertise permitted women to thwart white male aggression in a manner that precluded future wrath. As Englishman Senator Williams and a group of non-swimming male companions toured Jamaica in 1823, they paused to covetously watch 20 nude African-born women as they recreated African aquatic traditions with, quote, some washing their clothes, some washing themselves, while others swam about like nereids, end quote. When the voyeurs were discovered, the women on shore, quote, dashed into the water. When they were far enough from our masculine gaze, they popped their heads above water as they laughed and made fun of us, end quote. Emboldened by the men's inability to swim, the women flaunted their sexuality. Seductively gliding through waters that silhouetted their nude bodies, they provocatively sang about a white preacher who, quote, crossed the sea to make love, end quote, to enslaved women. Like Greek sirens, they allured the men to swim out and fulfill their sexual cravings. Indeed, Williams thinly veiled his desires, dubbing the song's composers Proserpine, a Greek goddess who had been raped by Hades. For the femme fatales, Jamaican waters were an empowering sanctuary encompassing the cruelties of plantation slavery. Here, they retained control of their nude bodies, even as men a few feet away sought to sexually dominate them. Now, instances like this, I mean, you have to imagine, right, that these women, they return home and they tell their husbands, their fathers, their children, you know, what had happened to them as they were bathing. And so I argue that instances like these helped African men and women understand how water could be used as a mechanism, right, for preventing abuse, and then also kind of thinking more largely, helping them to escape from slavery. And so as the paper that I circulated, the article that I circulated illustrates, to kind of to go through it, I mean, in the Americas, we oftentimes, I think, forget that most of slave experiences occurred along waterways, whether it was in the American South, where I have a number of images of plantations, or in, oh, my slides are in the wrong order, but or in other parts of the Americas, where I have these other images that reveal some of the aquatic activities that enslaved peoples were engaging in, right? With people using dugout canoes to fish and to take goods then to market, to sell them in their free time, to take goods to market, to sell them to white consumers, providing most white urban residents with much of their seafood. And the two images above me suggest this. And then the images to the left well, to my left, both indicate how enslaved Africans were forced to use canoes for their owners' benefit. But in the process, they end up retaining and recreating these African traditions, these African maritime traditions. And so then some other examples, right, of enslaved pearl divers above. The image that my head is kind of blocking, it's a little bit later, but it's coral divers, African coral divers in the Bahamas. But nonetheless, these are images, these are activities that enslaved people would have been doing. And another, I think, important thing, and I'm using this actually to this time, I think, to show you some of the images that I wouldn't have been able to include in the article, for the kind of visual representations of African aquatics and how enslaved people were able to carry them to the Americas. And so one of the things that I've been working on recently, as Ralph indicated, was surfing. And so Africans are unique in the world in the ways that they surfed and the ways that they used surfing. And so while scholarship is indicating that many peoples throughout the world surfed, Atlantic Africans are unique in that they used surfing as a way, I mean, with Atlantic Africa being deprived of natural harbors, the only way to get from ship to shore or from shore to offshore fisheries or shipping lanes before the arrival of Europeans was to pass through surf. And so what I'm arguing in my scholarship is that Africans used surfing as a means to an end. They're surfing to understand wavelengths, how to catch waves, and then they use that ability to actually man or crew dugout canoes. And they're unique in the sense that they use waves energy to actually surf goods to shore at least once per day. So if they're a fisherman, if they were a seagoing merchant, as the images to the left show, they're actually catching waves in order to reach shore. And so in that way, they are unique. Africans were unique. And then the image above my head, it's the only image that I know of that shows African surfboards. And so you have this group of people who had paddled out. I could actually, I thought I had a different, okay, here's the image here, a bigger image here. The two men at the top are sitting on surfboards. And so they've actually paddled out to at what's now Benin to dive for coins. And then some other images of paddle boards, right, at Lake Busamtwi in Ghana with these Fanti men. And so I want to circle back then to this other image, and I apologize, of Apele Hauafa and Walter Rodney, because it seems to me, although Hauafa's, he doesn't directly cite Walter Rodney or Boubacar Berry, but their conceptualization of West Africa and how they reframed West Africa, and some of some of Hauafa's discussions of reframing the Pacific into Oceania strongly suggest these influences of Rodney, and how Ha'uafa then conceives of the Pacific and Pacific Islanders not as people stranded on islands, but as the ocean, as being part of the broader kind of cultural understanding, and a way of connecting people, not of dividing people on islands, but connecting people. And so if we take, I argue then, as you've read, if we take the analysis of Walter Rodney and Apele Ha'uafa and some other scholars who have worked on island studies, particularly in the Pacific, but then also to a lesser extent in the Caribbean, and apply it to maritime marinage, we can begin to rethink how enslaved Africans understood the Caribbean, I argue, as an extension of Africa, right, connected to the ocean, and the Middle Passage isn't necessarily separating them from Africa, but that it's still, I mean, even though the Middle Passage separated them from Africa, that the ocean is still connecting them spiritually, culturally, and that there's these hopes and desires to return to Africa, whether in the here and now or in the afterlife. And so one of the other things then that I argue is, I think the thing that I'm pushing back on, and the article actually that I circulated was part of a larger project that I'll come back to, that I'm working on with myself and a few other scholars. And I actually, if people in the audience are working on maritime marinage in Africa or elsewhere, we actually would be willing to work with you, because there is a bigger online archive and a book coming out of this. And so what we're arguing is that while previous studies of maritime marinage have been really revealing, they've also been framed kind of narrowly, right? In that they oftentimes focus on why enslaved people fled from one island to another. So what was the push factor? What was motivating captives to leave one place? In a relationship that's been studied in significant depth has been, okay, what's causing Jamaicans to flee Jamaica to primarily Cuba, but then also to Puerto Rico. And so these kind of push and pull factors, but not really seeking to understand then how people crossed the ocean. I mean, Jamaica's about, as this map indicates, I put some of the distances and some of the routes that people were traveling. And so you can see that people, from Barbados to Martinique, they're traveling over 100 miles. From Jamaica to Haiti or to Cuba, again, over 100 miles. From the Turks and Caicos to Haiti, you can see, right, the distances that people are traveling, and that people were traveling between the Bahamas and Florida, between Caribbean islands and South America. And so how are they actually able to do that? I think is part of the other, I think another important question. What is giving them the ability to do that? And so what I argue is that they're using understandings of African hydrography, which is how the sea and wind patterns influence navigation. And so they're using morning offshore breezes to quickly escape from their enslavers, and then onshore breezes to return to shore. So they're fleeing, not when most captives would have fled in North America, or if they were going to engage in marinage on a particular island. Oftentimes people were fleeing in the middle of the night, whereas accounts of maritime marinage suggest that they're escaping in the morning, closer to like 6, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, and not at 10 or 11 or 12 at night. And so they're able to use these wind patterns. And so another, I think, important thing that we're going to build on in this book is looking at Caribbean patterns. And so this is a kind of, and I'm not sure what sort of maps are in, textbooks the kind of textbooks that we might use for high school students, or that you might use for high school students, or for freshmen, sophomores in South Africa. But we oftentimes have these kinds of images in our books in the United States. And they're made, as I say here, to indicate the difficulty really of navigating south from North America to the Caribbean. And it suggests just these kind of general patterns, wind patterns, that the prevailing patterns are always the same. But if you've spent much time in the Caribbean, you know that these wind patterns and current patterns are much more complicated than this sort of map indicates. And so here's a map that's done by the University of Florida using buoys. And you can see the different times with, and I think the one on the top might be cut off, but the bottom image is May to June. And you can see that these patterns, that they fluctuate, right? That there's different times of the year that would have made it easier for people to flee. While other times of the year, the winter, for example, if you're fleeing from Jamaica, the currents would have actually pushed you towards Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, and then into the Gulf of Mexico, where if you mistime things, you could end up just dying of starvation, or one would end up dying of starvation. And there's numerous accounts of ships picking up kind of starving people, maritime maroons in the Gulf of Mexico, because they've overshot. These currents cause them to overshoot Cuba and be again drawn into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. And so again, I want to show these other images because it's a little bit easier to see here. I mean, they're more complicated than the superficial currents that are often in textbooks, but they indicate how, yes, currents are flowing north, but as they're hitting land masses, as they're hitting islands and mainlands, they're bouncing off and they're circulating. And this indicates that Africans, and so as I argue that the Africans must have understood these wind patterns, these currents, in order to successfully navigate then to North America, or to other islands. And then I want to just end with thinking again with the future project, and what I'm talking about as far as the future project, and how, you know, I would encourage viewers to participate. And so for the past, really for the past 20 years or so, there hasn't been much scholarship published on maritime maroons. There was a significant amount of scholarship in the 1970s through the 1990s, but really since about 2000, even the mid 1990s, there hasn't been very much. And so what myself and the other scholars, historians, anthropologists that I'm working with, what we're seeking to do is to reconsider maritime marinage by placing it in the context of the African diaspora, and then using Atlantic history to understand how people moved about, how they were forcibly transported throughout the world, and then how they used aquatic skills, how they use surfboards, canoes, their swimming bodies to escape from captivity in one place to arrive someplace else. And so in reconsidering maritime marinage, we're also incorporating Africanist, right? I mean, so there is another historian who's coming aboard who's looking at maritime marinage in Sierra Leone during the 19th century. I know that enslaved people throughout Africa were similarly using canoes and swimming and possibly surfboards to escape from enslavement. And so also in part of that, and the reason why I put up the book of Drexia, if any of you are familiar or not familiar with it, it's this kind of Afrofuturism book, or books now. There's been a second volume that's been published. And it's kind of, I think, Drexia is kind of a play on how Africans or people of African descent are mapping the Atlantic world, where you have the older maps of the Atlantic, right, that were done by European cartographers that included sea monsters and things like that to kind of fill in the blanks. Whereas here in the book of Drexia, they're arguing the the basis of the narrative is that the bodies of the people who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage, they're rescued, as you can see from the cover art on the left. They're brought down into what Africans would have regarded as the realm of the dead, and they were recreated. I mean, they're given kind of aquatic abilities to swim underwater. And so what we're doing in kind of the online version of this project is creating a map that's going to represent how the ocean, how Africans used the ocean to create a sea of Caribbean islands that connected them to Africa. And so filling in the map, and also the rivers radiating off of the ocean, right? The African rivers, the rivers in the Americas, and indicating where the realm of the dead was, where the Kalunga was, where African deities resided. And so we're also looking not just at, say, historians, anthropologists, but artists, or we're looking for artists and literary scholars who might be willing to contribute to this project. And so I'll end it there and then open it up for discussion. I can stop the screen share, I guess.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Kevin. Yeah, I'm going to pick up on the mention of Drexciya at the end, and I know we've had a bit of conversation by email about Drexciya, and you're interested in working with the artist Abdul Haq, Abdul Kadim Haq, who does the artwork for Drexciya. And in fact, last week's guest on the seminar series, Louis Chod Soki, is friends with them. He was in Detroit just recently. But yeah, I've been fascinated by the Drexciya idea I think they've been around for about 20 years almost. And I think when I first heard of them around then, I was at the Detroit Electronic Music Festival in around 2000. So from my memory of the Drexciya story, the fantasy is that babies in the womb breathe water, they don't need to breathe air. And enslaved women were sometimes thrown overboard in the Middle Passage who were pregnant. And the idea is that the fetus or the baby manages to transition from the water breathing of the womb to the water breathing in the ocean, and that they become mer people in the ocean. And I think I was really struck by the powerful metaphor of it, that it's about survival and flourishing in the face of oppression and cruelty. And that seemed to, be a metaphor for other cultural processes of the diaspora, that how great creativity came out of this survival in the Black Atlantic. So yeah, I'm going to jump off from that and connect that to saying, well, an aspect of your work that I find interesting is the way that the ocean and water seems to have these multiple implications or symbolism. It's both becomes this barrier that prevents slaves and the descendants of slaves of getting back to Africa. And one of the areas that I work on in my art is the legacy of Marcus Garvey and the Black Star Line, which was this attempt to get the technology to return people across the ocean and take them back to Africa. So the ocean is this kind of barrier and separation, but then in your work, it's also becomes a means to escape. So it has seems to have these like dual meanings or multiple meanings of what the ocean and the water represents to slaves. So yeah, it's amazing to hear your accounts of its utility and people who had the background and the experience and the skills to be able to really utilize it. So yeah, I'll open up to further comments, and do you have any response to those kinds of that reading of the ocean as perhaps enabling and disabling at the same time?
So I think I really appreciate that opportunity, because I think that's an important point, is that, there's been these kind of dominant narratives in history that have suggested, right, that the ocean was only a place of suffering and death. And it's it's not even just history in the United States anyway, but it's history, it's in literature. I think even in the Western world, I mean, in the beginning of my book, I talk about like, I mean, if you look at like, say, the Bible and how the ocean is used as this kind of, well, the ocean is this place of chaos before creation. It's used as a mechanism for punishment in, say, the Great Flood. And so it's always had this, it's oftentimes had this symbolism attached to it. And then in the United States, the ocean, at least as far as African Americans are concerned, has oftentimes been seen culturally as a place of suffering, of misery. This kind of the symbolism of the Middle Passage and things like that. The hurricanes that have come out of the ocean and destroyed repeatedly enslaved communities. I mean, one thing I think it's important for understanding is that when hurricanes would sweep through the Caribbean and hit the American South, tens of thousands of enslaved people would die as a result. And so there's all of these kind of this negative symbolism. And then there's these historical memories that African Americans created in the 1950s, 1960s that are false, that I speak to, that are in some of my scholarship, make claims that that enslavers used water as a means of torture. And so this discouraged then African Americans from swimming, which results in a higher drowning death rate. And so, yeah, so there's these understandings or these perceptions of the ocean as being, again, this kind of foreboding place. And so what I argue is that, or one of the things that I argue is that we need to take our personal experiences and use that to understand the ocean. And so myself, as a surfer, I've begun to do that, to look at, okay, so the ocean has brought me a lot of pleasure. I mean, I grew up along the ocean. And so how do my understandings of the ocean inform my readings of history and historical events, and how enslaved people were using the ocean, how Africans and enslaved people were using the ocean? Because if we're only looking at the ocean as, like, say, the Middle Passage, I argue we've ignored a lot of the other kind of the swimming, the canoeing, the surfing that enslaved Africans were doing. And so by including that back in, then we can see how it is this place of hope, of opportunity, at the same time that it was a place of suffering.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kevin. Dominique, my colleague at Humor, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ralph, and thank you, Kevin. Fantastic research. I'm really looking forward to reading your other projects. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm working on the legacy of slavery in Madagascar, in coastal Madagascar. And the idea of the sea being like the site of the passage, but also site of freedom, it's really resonating. And in contemporary Madagascar, like the people who work in the sea, like fishermen, are really like the opposite of enslaved individuals, and that's how they exist in this society. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective. I was wondering, as you are working on comparative project in the Atlantic, if you are also interested, or if you have ever been collaborating with historians or anthropologists working in the Indian Ocean, especially in the Western Indian Ocean, in the Mascarenes, or in Madagascar, or in Mozambique, where the maritime culture of Australasia, India, the Arabian Peninsula are kind of combined. So yeah.
Yeah, so I've looked a little bit. I mean, I have done some research, right? And so there were captives, a significant number of Africans, a smaller, but still a significant number of captives from the east coast of Africa and Madagascar, who were brought to the Americas. And so we have, historians have looked at their culture, not just in maritime, but also in rice producing. For example, so my mentor, did a lot of his research on the rice growing traditions, which is tidal rice. They're using the ocean in order to force fresh water into rice fields. And so I mean, for me, I haven't done as much research in East Africa as I would like. But for the bigger project, no, definitely, we would welcome opportunities to work with people across disciplines in East Africa. And then also we are thinking of it more broadly. I mean, we are thinking about opening it up to even Australia and other places in the world to consider how enslaved people were using aquatic skills to escape from bondage.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Dom. Michelle, you go ahead.
Thanks. Hi there. Thanks for your presentation, Kevin and Rolf, for setting it up. Yeah, I was just wondering, actually, when I went for a surf in Maritime, often I've seen West African or people getting baptized there, like in the ocean. And actually on the drive to Maritime, there's quite a beautiful river, which is a little bit under contention at the moment, Black River Parkway, where also there's a lot of, also it seems West African people who like they pray every Sunday and Saturday sometimes by this river quite intensely, and also do a lot of, like, there's a lot of ceremony and rituals, and yeah, like it definitely goes on for like a few hours. So like it's not goes on, it's yeah, it's quite, from what I can tell, there's a lot of ritual, and it's quite lengthy, and so I just imagine there, as well as the aquatics being like a tool or a source or resource to flee and to gain, like, you know, fish or to gain things. I also just wondered, like, if there was any spiritual relationship to the sea that was there, and that is often like with surfers, where we feel really like connected to Mother Nature, and that whether any of those sorts of things. Obviously, it seems like most of the drawings and the documentation were through the eyes of a colonialist. But I was just wondering, like, if there was anything else you found, and also just if there was anything like female, because it's all guys that are getting pictures of, but actually women seem to, you know, in terms of the rivers, have this strong connection. In Africa, you always see the woman with the water on their heads, and it's a different relationship, but it's very intertwined and ingrained, like, in at least my mind of what I understand of Africa and their connection to water as a source. So I just wondered, yeah, a couple of those things there, and the spiritual nature of it, as well as if there is any mythology tied, like in a way that Rolf is sort of leaning towards with the mirrors.
Yeah, so there I mean, a lot. I mean, so in the African context, I mean, depending on where one is, bodies of water were typically regarded as, I mean, across kind of, if you're looking at Africa, across kind of ethnicity and particular spiritual beliefs, bodies of water, rivers, lakes, the ocean, were oftentimes regarded as sacred places. And so they were also, not just that the water was a sacred space, but it was also inhabited by deities, by water spirits. And if, say, a fisherman, a swimmer, by extension a surfer, were to pay respect, reverence to those deities, you know, those deities would guide fishermen to schools of fish, for example. They would guide maritime merchants to along safe passages. I mean, kind of going off the Book of Drexel a little bit, they also would allow people to shapeshift. I mean, so like on the Congo River, as maritime merchants were traversing the Congo River, they believed that water deities could actually create fog banks that would protect them from pirates, or would transform them in the eyes of pirates into just kind of floating debris, you know, branches and things floating down the river. And so there were those sorts of beliefs. there's also this belief then that depending on where you are, that a large body of water was the realm of the dead, that the realm of the dead existed either at the bottom of a large river or across a river or across a lagoon or the ocean. So again, depending on where one is situated. And so, yeah, so there's these other beliefs. And then that when one died, their spirit went into the water, right? The ancestral spirits were residing in the water, waiting to be reborn. And so then those spirits, as they're waiting to be reborn, again, depending on the society, but for example, the Igbo of Nigeria believed, as well as other people, that the spirit would then go from the ocean into silk cottonwood trees. And then that's where it would wait to be reborn. And then these silk cottonwood trees, because of their qualities of being rot resistant, were oftentimes used as for crafting canoes, surf canoes and other types of canoes. And so the spirit of the tree would continue to live on in that canoe. And so the canoe is also a sacred space being used on sacred waters. And so spirituality was very much wrapped into all of this. As far as gender, so it's interesting that you bring that up. So women in Africa, in the African context, women were, I mean, labor was gendered. And so women were doing many of the same things that men were, but then oftentimes in a gendered component. And so, for example, cowrie shells, which were oftentimes in many societies used as a form of currency, women often dove for those. So that was a female occupation. Women could use dugout canoes to transport goods to kind of daily or weekly markets, on a shorter distance. But then in terms of long distance trade, it was typically men that were engaged in that sort of aquatic activity. But then as far as like the skills are concerned, I mean, one thing that European sources, while they typically described men, it's clear that women were as strong a swimmer and underwater divers as men. I mean, there's numerous accounts of women in Africa and the Americas out swimming men in races, diving as deep as men to harvest shellfish. And so, yeah, there's unfortunately the sources, I mean, they're European, as you said, most of the sources are European authored men. And so they're interacting with African men. But no, they're very much, I mean, women were very much engaged in these aquatic activities in Africa and in the Americas. But in the Americas, because Westerners, because maritime activities were considered to be male occupations, when they're formally kind of working for enslavers as on canoes, as salvage divers, as pearl divers, it's men that were doing it and not women. So enslavers exclude women from those kind of things.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I was really struck in your paper about the account of dugout canoes almost being like people, or they were animate. They had names and genders and spirits in them. That was very interesting. Minga, my colleague Minga, you're first in line.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin, for such a wonderful presentation. And also the reason why I responded, because my research is on water. I'm looking at water and sociality, looking at the relationships that people with water. But I'm I applaud you, because you're trying to do something that, many scholars never done before, in a sense that, you spoke about a couple of things that I made note of, looking at water, what water does. And also you're trying to disrupt, the norm, what we know about water, thinking of water as something of a nightmare, but which it is sometimes in one sense, because water is the only element on Earth that comes in three different forms, solid, liquid, and other form. Now, this can be a comment or might not be a comment, or can be something that stimulates your this conversation. I like the part you spoke about, and also Ralph touched on that issue, and also the previous Michelle also spoke about it, not directly, about where we come from as human being. We come from water, because if you look at we as a body, we are covered in what we call amniotic water. You know that people call, when women say my water is broken, is that amniotic? It shows where we come from. Without water, life could not exist. At the same time, we looking at water that can create relationships, and also water can also be an element of nightmares. And I think this is where most of scholarships are trying to stack on that. But what you're trying to do is to disrupt that and say, African had a relationships with water long time ago. In my research, I also tried to show that, the relationships that African had with water until the encounter with colonial, with slavery, where they disrupt most mode of living of the African people. And also, the other part that I like that you touched on is the section where you spoke about the rite of passage, And I made a note because I wrote this article and I was afraid of publishing it. It's just sitting there. I've written it for, I think, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, because it's problematic of stuff that I've spoken about, because they came from my heart, looking at the what we call black radical thought, as an American, you know where it comes from, because previously American did not have lives, families, because families were disrupted using water, at the same time, were disrupted. And I think the person who brought together also, I don't know if you touch on that issues of what Maya Angelou spoke about, the rite of passage. I'm just going to read something quick. It didn't come from me, how and what she spoke. And how do we write about the lived experience of people that went through that difficult time and try to bring it to the current time? So this is what she said. She said that they were male and female, all lived in a dungeon, meaning the ship that they were carried to go to the America. There was not enough space for all of them to sleep. So they had devised the mechanism of coping while lying down on their back on top of each other's. And sometimes something further happened, because there were women who could not have the privilege to attend to their menstrual cycle. And she said, we lay in each other's menstrual blood, These are very powerful, metaphor that she brought in her book. Explain the rite of passage, what happened at water during that particular period. But I think I'm not going to carry on with much comment. This is just to stimulate the conversation that you're doing, and I applaud you for that, because most of the literature that we have on water look at it in one lens, speaks about one thing. But I think what you're trying to look, this is where Michelle is trying also to push you, is to look at also the traditional way of looking at water, the cosmic side of water, the relationships that people have with water. And I think your project is huge, is big. And I don't know if you'll be able to cover all these aspects of what water can forge. So thank you. That was just my comment.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I took some notes. The one thing I would add in, because you got me thinking about it and like kind of the sources and who's writing these things. And I really appreciate the Maya Angelou. I want to return to that in my scholarship and in my teaching too. I mean, because that's a really powerful way, I think, of looking at the Atlantic slave trade. But just really briefly, like kind of sources and what sources are telling us and how we need to read against sources is suicide. So like during the Middle Passage, as slave traders are throwing people overboard, right? Creating Drexia, right? By throwing bodies overboard because they've lost their value. And at the same time, though, people are committing suicide. Enslaved Africans, they're leaping overboard to commit suicide. And so many of the accounts written by slave traders are that these people are that the Africans are actually trying to deny them, are spiteful, are vengeful, that they're jumping overboard to deny them of the profits of their body, right? I mean, that's oftentimes written, that by killing themselves, they're no longer, the slave traders are no longer able to sell them. And so for a long time, like the way we've looked at suicide has been through the lens of the enslaver, that's kind of the end of it. And there's this high rate of death and suicide. But myself, and then a friend of mine, Terry Snyder, she's also written about suicide. And what we've said is like, okay, so what's actually going on? Like if you have people who are strong swimmers, first of all, how are they able to commit suicide? And why are they committing suicide? And so what I argue is that they're committing suicide so they can be reborn in the societies that they were taken from. That water, if you look at it in the African context, is this medium for transmigration, for transporting the soul back to the society that it had been taken from. And so, yeah, I mean, I think as you're saying, Minga, and as Michelle, I mean, we need to flip that like we need to stop looking at water, and not just water, but historical accounts and literature from one perspective, and look at it from different perspectives and how different peoples are interpreting whether it's art, whether it's literature, whether it's historical accounts.
Thank you, Kevin. I see two sets of hands. So first, Nabil, a few connections there, and then after that, Oriol. Nabil, you've said to me that your connection is unstable, so I'm just going to. Are you able to ask?
Yes, thank you so much, Ralph. I really, sorry, I skipped the first part of the presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to listen to Professor Kevin Dawson for such an amazing talk. Yes, I'm really interested in the historical genealogy of these aquatic cultures and how they can unfold different narratives beyond the dominant narratives of slave transportation from the transatlantic, and see other ways of captivity vis-a-vis the aquatic culture. Like in the Moroccan context, we can look at the different accounts and how many Western white figures have been held captive by Moroccan corsairs during the last few centuries, and how these actually, and there are actually many travel narratives that reveal this white captivity, and many Moroccan corsairs and pirates hold Western people captive, and including Père de Caris, when Resuni asked for a ransom. It was even announced in the New York Times at the time, at the end of the 19th century. Again, when it comes to surfing, I see that it has also other dimension of other accounts. In the Moroccan context, we see that surfing was introduced in the 60s of the last century, when European descent from Europe and other parts of the West to come and practice that. But Moroccan people started to adopt the surf culture and rework it for themselves, especially Moroccan youth, and see water and surfing as an alternative and as a means of income. And for example, they see it's a way For example, for those who are unsuccessful to cross the borders into Europe, they see surfing as an alternative. For example, having to make a visa marriage, for example, trying to find a white woman who can take them to Europe, or these Rastafarians making themselves known in this way, and how they increase their opportunities and chances to go to Europe. So apart from practicing surfing as an entertainment, and there is this emerging field of critical surf studies, and we can see many power dynamics in this, how it goes beyond surfing as a sport, but also as a site of contestation, of resistance and agency, especially for indigenous people.
Thank you, Nabil. Yeah, Nabil is my colleague based in Morocco, who is a surfer as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, you raised a lot of, I think, really good points. I mean, the one thing I mean, I don't know Morocco, and I mean, I've been invited to participate in some of the critical surf study scholarship, and so in some ways I am familiar with it, although it's kind of more on the periphery. The one thing though that I would argue is that, you know, perhaps surfing was indigenous to Morocco. I mean, I argue in my other work that surfing, I mean, the sources indicate or suggest strongly that it was indigenous throughout West Africa, or throughout Atlantic Africa, that people were surfing at least as far north as Senegal, and then down into the Congo-Angola region, and that also indigenous Americans were surfing. I mean, there are accounts of peoples in the Caribbean surfing, and California Indians surfing as well. And so one of the things that scholars are beginning to argue is that, like, to some extent, people throughout the world, much of the world, were probably surfing. But it's how we define surfing. So we define surfing now as like kind of standing up. I mean, we're actually using a Western definition of surfing, with people standing to ride waves, and not even using the traditional Hawaiian definition of surfing, which is, you know, where people were surfing, whether they were standing, sitting, or lying down. And so in some ways, we've relegated traditional methods of surfing, I think, by saying that it's only standing up. And so, you know, I would maybe look at some of the older sources. I mean, you're in. I mean, I'm taking you from Morocco, and so that you probably know some of the, or many of those sources that actually people were probably surfing in Morocco, and throughout the Indian Ocean as well. I mean, in addition to like North America and Africa.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to ask Oriol to speak.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Ralph. Very interesting. Yeah, so I'm gonna just. I was quite interested in two concepts that came up based on what you were talking about from a personal experience perspective. Because I kind of grew up with living by the sea, and actually started off with bodyboarding for about 5 or 6 years. And then I got into surfing in my 20s. But there was something that drew me to the sea as a kid, to kind of get away. So the first concept is around escape. And I think it's interesting when you look at it in the past, that concept of escape from civilization and structure and that kind of thing. And for me, I used to go to a private school and used to do rugby and kind of all of these team sports, very structured, competitive sports. And all I really wanted to do was go and bodyboard and be in the sea and get out. And I felt that maybe it could be like an extroverted kind of personality type that you want to kind of get away, and the sea was a place to relax and kind of get away from that. And I ended up leaving that school to go to another school where they would actually allow me to bodyboard every day. So that was quite an interesting thing. I just thought from a personal perspective, how we perceive the ocean, and from a personality trait perspective. And I wonder also in the past, maybe there was an element of getting away, escaping, not necessarily just to get to the other side, but also just to get away from whatever rules and structure they had on those islands. And then the other concept, was more just kind of around how they must have read the oceans. Having kind of grown up with bodyboarding, I used to kind of study the winds, and so I was obviously more in it from a pleasure perspective, not necessarily trying to survive or go out and fish or anything like that. But I got quite obsessed with understanding the winds, and we had in those times the internet was just coming out, and you could read the synoptic charts and kind of see when a cold front was coming in. And I think naturally over time, I mean, obviously those weather charts helped me predict when the waves were going to be good, but I naturally also kind of got to read the elements around me, like you were presenting around the currents and everything. So I'm quite interested maybe how they potentially might have got read the weather, and potentially maybe even storms, because that was something that I would always sense when they were coming in, also reading the weather patterns. And I wonder if they maybe had a higher sensory kind of an ability to read when storms or when things were going to get, quite rough out there, compared to now, where we've got a lot of other tools that help us predict things, and maybe also how the storms might have affected those islands and behavior.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I mean, similar thing, like, I mean, growing up in Southern California, you could tell where a storm, I mean, I would do the same thing to figure out waves. If it's cloudy, it's only going to rain if the clouds are coming from kind of the north, the northwest. If they're coming from overland, they're not going to impact you. It's not going to rain. And when you're in the Caribbean, and then also, like, I've spent a good bit of time in West Africa, especially Ghana, and the same sort of patterns. I mean, it might get cloudy, but it's, I mean, I've been with farmers, with fishermen, and learned pretty quickly that no, it's only going to rain if the clouds are coming from the ocean. If they're coming from overland, it's not going to rain. And understanding those kind of storm patterns and how they're going to impact. And so, yes, I mean, they did understand this. I mean, it's harder to get at those because at least from the perspective of enslaved people, because they're not leaving all of the sources, right? There's not a lot of written records for them. But if you look kind of post-slavery at the accounts written by fishermen, and I've actually done, while I'm a historian, trying to fill in these gaps. I've done a lot of anthropological work, like interviewing fishermen, whether they're fishing out to sea or going into tide pools and harvesting conch, like swimming and diving and harvesting conch and octopus and things like that. And so they definitely understand still, the directions that storms are coming in. At first I was kind of like dismissive of people and when they were telling me, like, I thought like they're just being kind of hyperbolic or maybe trying to impress me by telling me, like, you could tell if a storm was coming out, the severity of a storm, by the way that fish would move, or that marine creatures would move, or the abundance of marine creatures in a particular area or the absence of them. But I actually suspect that they're right, that they were gauging things, I know, by the temperature of the water. So a storm front by just putting their hand in the water, by the color of the water, that the ocean would actually change color as a storm was coming. And so again, at first I thought, it's just kind of hyperbole or they're trying to impress me. But and this was like 20 years ago when I first thought this, and I haven't been able to go back and I mean, I'm only going back now and kind of re-examining some of those sources, some of those interviews, to try and understand kind of what you're getting at. But they clearly did understand that and understood patterns. I mean, if you know the Caribbean, and in Caribbean surfing, and I'll end it here, is like, you know, waves, it's not certain islands. I mean, it's like Hawaii, right? Where the North Shore breaks in the wintertime, the South Shore breaks in the summertime. And so the Caribbean islands, like if you look at Barbados, for example, which is in the Southeast Caribbean, waves break year round in the wintertime, but only on the Atlantic side in the summertime. And so people understood kind of how storms created surf patterns and currents and things like that. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it there. If I don't know, I know we're running short on time too.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Ariel. Great. Yeah, we are at the end of our seminar time, but thank you very much, Kevin, for spending some time with us and beaming in, surfing the internet from California. Thanks also to Andy Davis. I see you've been in the room with us here, and Andy is from Mami Wata, and thanks to Mami Wata that I first came across your work, Kevin. So thank you very much. Thanks to my colleagues. Next week is going to be the last attire seminar of this year, and it's Joseph Oduro Frimpong who will be speaking. He's the director of the Center for African Popular Culture at Ashesi University in Ghana. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks, Kevin.